When we look at all of this, we need to look at it through a lens that's a little bit more open. And this is the problem that we had when we went back and looked at the coverage of the war in Iraq, as I did in a film called WMD, Weapons of Mass Deception. What did I find? That the media itself was ahead of the government in promoting war, in promoting conflict, and all the rest of it. So, these are the issues we need to kind of sort out and look through. Russ Baker is with us now. Russ, you've been looking at all this also. Give us the thrust of your argument about this in this brilliant article you wrote, Seriously.
Sure. Now, I haven't been able to hear your discussion thus far, unfortunately, and I hope I'm not repeating anything. But basically, my point in that article published on our website, whowhatwhy.com, is that the media coverage of what is happening in Syria is, and this will be a familiar theme to anyone who listens to Danny and knows his work over the years, is abominable. It is as bad as the reporting that preceded the invasion of Iraq. It is as bad as the reporting in Libya. And this is a theme that we keep on covering on our site because we're just so frustrated with the failure to make any kind of progress at all on this stuff. Even with all these new means of communicating with the Internet, we don't see a serious discussion reaching many people in terms of what are the geostrategic agendas behind what is going on here.
What's interesting also is after the Iraq War, some of the poobahs of the mass media, mainstream media, even the network, ABC, that I used to work for, uttered sort of neo-apologies, Yes, maybe we bought the Kool-Aid, we drank the Kool-Aid, maybe we didn't fully appreciate the nuances of the conflict, et cetera, and so forth. But nothing seems to have changed. If anything, it seems to have gotten worse. I mean, you're writing on this. Glenn Greenwald's writing on this. William Bowles writing on this. The contributions that I've been making have all been attempting to say, hey, people, ask deeper questions. And I'm talking to the media also. I mean, I'm not like a stranger. I work there. I know these guys, And I'm saying, hey, don't you think it would be a good idea if you're going to cover a conflict to cover it with two sides, if there are more, or more than two sides? How do we account for the fact that Al-Qaeda has now gotten involved in the Syrian opposition? Are they a pro-democracy force? If you read the New York Times editorial page, they're talking about, Russia and China are opposing a pro-democracy movement. Well, is it a pro-democracy movement?
I'll tell you what the problem is here. Because so much of what the media tells us is untrue, that it's impossible for them at any particular point in time suddenly to switch to truth. And because they don't cover the basic motivations behind policy, it's too hard to explain this to their audiences. It would seem like there had been a sudden and dramatic personality change, a whole new worldview embedded, and so forth. I mean, the reality is this: governments don't do things for the reasons that they say they do. Almost never. And if they did, it would almost be a dereliction of duty, because the reality is that when you work inside a government, just like when you work inside a company, your job is supposed to be to do what's good or what's perceived to be good for your government or your faction or your bosses, not something else. And so things like going abroad and doing things for democracy in other countries is entirely inconsistent with what the agenda actually is. The agenda, rightly or wrongly, is this so-called national security. Now, the interpretation of that, of course, is all about oil and other natural and strategic resources. And so that is where all the internal discussions go. The external statements are all on a completely different level, and the media has a problem, because what are they going to do? Is ABC News going to say, tonight the government claimed they're going into Syria, but we found the real reason, powerful American corporations that donate tremendous amounts of money to campaigns want to neutralize Syria because they're causing problems for their interests in a neighboring country. I mean, you can't go there.
Well, it's also the question of how news is structured and what news is reported and what news isn't. The United States is about, let's say, to invade or Iran, but Whitney Houston dies, at the same time.
Yeah.
What's going to get the attention? What story is going to get the most follow-up? The one that they perceive as the most interest in the audience, rather than trying to interest the audience in these issues, they're presented in a way that really turns people off, tunes them out. They really can't follow it all. As a consequence, the narrative, the frame of how the story is put together is one that's basically intended to reassure Americans, you're good, they're bad. Look at these horrible things happening over there, et cetera, et cetera. Always to put American policy objectives in the most beneficent terms possible. By the way, just one second, Russ, 888-874-4888, 888-874-4888 if you want to join the conversation. You were saying.
Yeah, I mean, you are the expert. You literally and figuratively wrote the book on all of these things, and so I don't need to tell you. But, I mean, my take increasingly from my own work and the difficulty that I've had, like you, within the mainstream or corporate media, getting the truth out, and also, as you know, with my book, Family of Secrets, an entirely new history of the United States, of what the Bush dynasty was really about, what was really going on. This is all shocking. The stuff that we produce at whowhatwhy.com is shocking to people. Now, the reason it's shocking is because they're getting lies all the time. And really what's so insidious about this is that the untruths don't just come from places like Fox News, and they don't just come from entities, large corporate television entities that are expected to be somewhat bland. They come from supposedly liberal institutions. They come from places like newspapers like the New York Times. They come from things like PBS and NPR. Even the liberal magazines, The Nation, some of these others, good in many respects, but ultimately they pull their punches on a lot of things. And the reason that they do, I mean, just has to do with practicality, what they think they can get away with their readers, what is just too shocking, too jarring, what is too upsetting, forces people.
Well, a lot of it has to do with, the theory of power, how they see the country as really organized and in whose interests. If you take an approach, United States is a formal institutional approach. There's our Congress, there's our Supreme Court, there's our White House, there are checks and balances. Everyone is elected and is representative somehow of the voters that they elected. Then you report the news in that way, without asking deeper questions about who's putting up the money here, who's manipulating things behind the scenes, what are the corporate interests actually doing. So your view of things is a through rose-colored glasses, and you don't really get to ask or understand any deeper reasons. Bill Bowles, who I was going to have on the program with us, offers a little bit of a perspective in his website, williambowles.info. He basically he says that Edward Said, who was a professor at Columbia University, now deceased, called all this Orientalism, the idea that countries, especially those of the Arab world, exist only as inventions in the minds and actions of us in the West. We have a similar invention for Africa, still called, you'll not be surprised to hear, the Dark Continent on the BBC as recently as a couple of weeks ago. A throwaway comment, no doubt, but it illustrates the contradiction of any of us here in the West, allegedly of the left or right, passing judgment on the goings-on former colonies, or in the case of Syria, a relic of the Cold War. It's not surprising that in their present form, all the countries getting, quote, democratized are actually countries that were formerly dominated by colonial masters. Borders, languages, as well as the irreparable damage that colonizing did to indigenous culture are still subjected to into a Western gaze decades after they allegedly gained their independence.
There's something else going on which is quite insidious. It's been the topic of several of our recent articles, and that is the subterranean plotting going on behind the scenes relative to Syria, to Libya, and so on. In the case of Syria, for example, the Assad family from the Alawite sect, a Shiite minority in the country. Again, just the flip side, in a sense, of Saddam Hussein being part of a particular minority in his country, Sunni in his case. And so what you see there is important alliances that aren't being discussed. For example, Assad being aligned with the Shiites in Iran. Now, on the other side, you've got Saudi Arabia, a Sunni, and threatened by an uprising in their own country of Shiites, and not just in their own country, but in the most important oil-bearing region, the Eastern Province. And that uprising is believed to be fomented by those with links to Syria and Iran. And so Saudi Arabia, as one of its top priorities, is obviously for the royal family to stay in power, to suppress the uprising in their country, and that means to suppress what they perceive to be sponsors of the threat to their own power, and that is Syria and Iran. And so I think Saudi Arabia is a key player behind both of these aggressions, much more so, actually, believe it or not, than Israel, which I don't think actually really does have a dog in that fight, or than the United States, similarly.
Well, the Israeli lobby is basically trying to get Congress to take a harder line towards Syria, a harder line towards Iran. In some ways, Syria is the stalking horse. Get rid of that government in Syria, and then we can move on in a united way to deal with Iran. So Iran, is very much being targeted right now. And, of course, anything Iran says is treated with suspicion or negative reactions. The consequence there being that we really don't know much about Iran. I was just in Iran, Russ. I just, I interviewed the president. Now, I'm not saying it was a brilliant interview. It was just a conversation in passing. But certainly they have a different perspective than we do. And that perspective at least deserves to be reported. Here we have increasingly the Daily Beast and other outlets suggesting there's a link between Al-Qaeda and Iran. At the same time, Reuters is reporting that Al-Qaeda is deeply involved in Syria. So how do you make sense of all this?
Well, I'll tell you how you make sense of it, and this gets to another level of the kind of stories that people don't want to touch in this country, and that is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia. Now, as you may know, on our website, whowhatwhy.com, if you go to the top right-hand column under Original Investigations, you can read an investigation, new evidence linking the Saudi royal family to 11 of the 9/11 hijackers, and I mean in a rather direct sense that has never been reported before. Now, this story, part of which was broken by us at Who, What, Why, part of which was broken by the Miami Herald, a mainstream paper, has been entirely ignored by the totality of the media establishment, ranging from the mainstream ones all the way over to leftist, liberal websites, magazines, TV shows. They have all ignored this. This stuff is just too disturbing to people. And what you're talking about vis-a-vis Syria, with Al-Qaeda coming in, I mean, when you know what the real nature of that relationship is, you realize it's something else entirely is going on. And the effort to try to say that Al-Qaeda and the West disagree on the appropriate course in Syria, I think is just a distraction.
Well, these are issues that really need more attention. They really need to be examined. Russ Baker, the work that you're doing on your website, and are very courageous, because you're tackling a whole narrative that's uncritically accepted by the American people, by the American government, and by the American media. There are very few voices in the media that are challenging any of this at all. There are a couple of websites where you do have more critical ideas being expressed. the ICH clearinghouse, I'm just trying to think of a bunch of them. Salon has Glenn Greenwald, your website. But these are not really enough to challenge the power of the American media, not just to report something, but to reinforce it endlessly, repeat it. And in that case, it begins to sink into people's minds, and their view of things tends to be very simplistic and is essentially writing a blank check for the administration to engage in yet another war to get us involved in even more intervention. We've just had a report about how the covert agencies of the U.S. military are all coordinating and getting more resources. You can be sure that some of them are involved covertly in what's happening in Syria.
Oh, absolutely. There is no way that the kinds of things we're seeing happening there, the flows of weaponry, many of the incidents could possibly happen without that. And in fact, as I just pointed out in an article the other day, in Libya, where they tried to present that as entirely a spontaneous uprising, after the fact they were bragging about how involved they were in there, covertly forcing the inevitable conclusion. And so the fact that we can't even apply their admissions in Libya to Syria tells you how bad things are. But I have to say that I know you were talking about how it's not having enough of an impact, but I would argue that it's just that not enough people know about these things. I know that in the case of our website, whowhatwhy.com, we're fairly new. Most people haven't heard of it. More and more do every day. But it really is, the great thing about the Internet is it's there for all to read, and we also work very hard not to take a particularly obvious partisan approach.
Russ, yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off, but part of what I'm trying to do here is to promote websites like yours and other voices that are not heard in the mainstream media, and I really appreciate your coming on to join us.